Hello, I'm Megan Moore with Legislative Services, and I'm going to get started with today's presentation on how non-school levies are set. I'm a research analyst with the Legislative Services Division, and I staff the Revenue Interim Committee and the House Taxation Committee. This is the second in our Property Tax Tuesdays schedule of lunch and learns, and we have 3 more coming up on school funding, property tax assistance, property tax and school funding tools. My contact information is here on the first slide in case you have any follow-up questions. So today we're going to talk about how mill levies are set, but not school levies. We're focusing on county and city levies, and this also applies to special districts. As you probably know, there's a limit on property taxes that exists in state law. It's in 1510-402, and this is a limit to 1996 property tax levels. However, though that limit exists, the calculation in 1510-420 does allow for some growth from inflation and newly taxable property so that the taxes being paid today are not at 1996 levels. I'm going to take you through this graphic on the right in a moment, but first I wanted to talk about it more generally. This is a summary of how local governments will calculate their maximum mill levy. And there are 2 main components to the calculation. The first is to determine the amount of property tax that is authorized. And the second is to determine which mill levy will raise that amount of revenue using the taxable value of the jurisdiction. If you click on the graphic in this slide, it will take you to a white paper that has more information about the calculation 1510-420, and you'll be able to see the graphic perhaps more easily. So moving through the steps of the graphic, the first step is to determine the amount of authorized property tax. And the way this is done is to take the prior year property tax amount and to adjust it by an inflationary factor. That inflationary factor is the 3-year average consumer price index divided in half. Now that amount is kind of set that amount aside in your mind for a moment. And at this point, we're going to determine the taxable value for the jurisdiction to use in this calculation. And we'll start with the current year taxable value that is certified to the jurisdiction by the Department of Revenue. But there are 3 adjustments to this amount. The first one is to remove the newly taxable property. And a note on newly taxable property, this is new construction. It also includes newly subdivided property and property that's gone from exempt to non-exempt status, but it does not include increases in value from reappraisal. And this newly taxable property is removed from the current year taxable value because when a jurisdiction is growing, they may have a need for additional infrastructure or services to provide to that newly taxable property. So when we're calculating the maximum levy, that amount is taken out in order to do the calculation. However, that property will be subject to the tax when it's levied. The next item that's taken out is the total incremental taxable value of districts that use tax increment financing. And the reason this amount is taken out is because that money is not available to the county or city government. The taxes levied on that incremental taxable value are retained by the tax increment financing district. So if we left that in there, would be an inaccurate amount of how much revenue the local government actually receives. The third item that is removed is net and gross proceeds taxes imposed on metal and coal mines. And this is only a factor in a limited number of communities. And the reason that this is removed is because this revenue can be volatile and it prevents the number of mill levies from drastically changing from year to year. So After determining that adjusted taxable value by subtracting those three things from the current year taxable value, in step 2A, we simply divide that amount by 1,000 to get the adjusted taxable value per mil. And that takes us to step 3, at which point it's a simple division problem to calculate the current year mill levy. And that's the authorized property tax from step 1 divided by the taxable value per mil in step 2A. So that gives us what I would refer to as the preliminary mill levy calculation. And the reason it's preliminary is because there is a provision that allows for carryover of unused mill authority to a future year. So I'm in the circular decision box in the middle there in orange, and this is, at this point, the local government determines whether they have carryover from a prior year, and in step 5, if they do have that, they would add it to the preliminary mill levy that they calculated to get the current year levy. Moving on to step 5, at this point, the local government will determine how much revenue they would actually raise from their maximum levy amount. And to do that, they take the levy amount that they've determined in step 4 and multiply it by the current year taxable value minus the total incremental value of TIFs. And the reason, again, that TIF revenue has to come out is because it's not available to the local jurisdiction. However, you'll note in this calculation, we are not removing newly taxable property or the net and gross proceeds taxes. And the reason is because both of those entities will be taxed with the mill levy. So this is going to give us a total amount of revenue that will be available to the local jurisdiction. So at that point, the local government has a decision to make, and they have to decide what mill levy they want to raise, and they'll look at their budget and determine how much revenue they need for their budget, and they'll set the mill levy. So once they've set that levy in step 6, they will take the levy they set and multiply it by the current year taxable value, again, less the total revenue from tax increment financing districts, and that determines how much revenue they expect to raise for the year. And if they've levied less than the maximum authorized in step 7, they would note how many mills they have left to carry forward to a future tax year, and that would be available to them in the next year. So that is a theoretical explanation of the way the calculation works. And this slide shows the spreadsheet that is available to local governments to make this calculation. And when the slides are posted online, if you click on this graphic, it will take you to the Montana Association of County websites. And the MACO is currently hosting this spreadsheet. It used to be hosted by the Department of Administration, but they're no longer doing it. So this will take you to the MACO website, and there is a place to click on calculations, and you'll find this worksheet there if you're interested in using it. I'll note this is only about 2/3 of the worksheet. There are additional lines, but I wanted you to be able to see it, so I didn't capture the entire worksheet. If you are interested in doing this calculation for your local government, feel free to contact me and I can help you gather the information you would need to do an actual calculation. The way this worksheet works is you enter the numbers in the yellow boxes and they calculate in the salmon boxes. It's a fairly easy exercise to do, but as you watch the numbers appear, it can help you understand how the calculation works. In this slide, I'm showing some of the information that you would need to do the calculation. The first thing you need is the certified taxable value, which is available on the Department of Revenue website. If you click on this slide, it will take you to the 2024 taxable values. This is a screenshot of a 2023 taxable value that I used in a revenue interim committee exercise. You can see this was for Lake County, and then the numbers that are used in the exercise are the total taxable value, which is circled on the right, the TIF increment, the newly taxable property, and the net and gross proceeds, which is 0 in Lake County and is 0 in many cities and counties. The other information that is needed is information from the prior year worksheet. And if you click on this graphic, it will take you to the Department of Administration website where they include local government budget documents. And the easiest place to get the information is off this worksheet, but many local governments that have good information on their website also include the information there. And so you just need the prior year version of the worksheet so you can gather the total tax revenue assessed in the prior year, any net or gross proceeds taxes, and any carry forward mills. So now that we've talked about the calculation, I want to kind of step back and talk about it again in kind of a broad brush. The purpose of the calculation in 1510-420 is to determine how much revenue a local government can raise at the maximum level. And the way to do that is to just take the revenue that's allowable and divide it by the taxable value to get the allowable mills. If either the taxable value changes or the allowable revenue changes, then this is going to change the mills, and we call this floating mills. This can also result in tax shifting between individual properties and between classes of properties. And the way I like to think about it is that your taxes will change based on how your property value is changed in comparison to other properties. And so if the value for everyone has gone up, the mills will reduce, but if your property value went up disproportionately to other properties, then you may pick up a larger share of the tax burden. The other thing I want to note is, as I said, the 1510-420 calculation is for cities and counties and special districts. It is not for local school levies. Those are calculated using the school funding formula, which will be the topic of next week's Tuesday Lunch and Learn. However, 1510-420 does apply to the state mills, the 95 mills for school equalization, and the 1.5 mills for vocational technical education. And the way this calculation works is that DOR prepares the calculation, and these mills can only float down. They cannot exceed the statutory caps because they're listed in statute. However, the Supreme Court determined last summer that even though the mills may not exceed the statutory cap, when performing the calculation, the amount of revenue raised may exceed the statutory maximum, and any excess revenue may be carried forward to a future year. And that's why the full 95 mills was levied in 2024. And so by way of summary, 1510-420 allows us to calculate the maximum revenue from non-voted levies. We're going to talk about voted levies in a moment. It allows an inflationary adjustment to the prior year revenue. It allows growth from newly taxable property. It allows the carry forward of unused mills, and I underlined mills here because the actual statute says that mills are carried forward, and depending on what happens with the taxable value of a jurisdiction, when those mills are levied in a future year, they could be worth more or less than they were worth in the year in which they were not used. Finally, there are certain levies that are exempt from 1510-420. The list here is not exhaustive, but I think this is some of the more common ones. A judgment levy that results from a lawsuit, for example, that a jurisdiction has to pay, a levy to repay taxes under protest, an emergency levy, and then this last one is for local government health insurance contributions. There's a statutory formula for that levy, and it is not included in the 1510-420 calculation. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about voted levies. The voted levies are authorized under 1510-425, and there are three purposes listed in that statute. The first is to impose a new mill levy. The second is to increase a mill levy. And the third is to exceed the limit in 1510-420. The way in which a local government prepares that voted levy is to list the specific purpose for the levy, list either the amount of money or the number of mills that they wish to levy, and to include a durational limit which may be permanent. They would then put that question on the ballot for voters to vote on. This next slide shows you some examples of statutory language for voted levies. I do want to note that I don't know whether these levies passed. They're just here to demonstrate what the ballot language looks like. The first one is a levy that's listed by number of mills. It's for the St. Ignatius Rural Fire District levy. It's for 6.19 mills over 7 years. And you'll note that while they're asking for 6.19 mills, they do have to give an approximate amount of revenue that they expect to raise, which is just over $27,000 per year. The next example is for the Town of Plains Street Special District, and this is a levy listed as a dollar amount. They're requesting $50,000 annually for no more than 5 years. And for the current year, they estimate that would take 43.63 mills to raise. The third example is a bit of a hybrid. This one is subject to 1510-420, and this is for a Lewis and Clark County operation and maintenance of the county's detention center. You can see they're asking for a levy for 15 years for $4 million annually. And they estimate that would be 31.75 mils in the year they voted on it. However, they also included language that the $4 million will be subject to section 1510-421A after the first year. And what this means is they would take the $4 million and run it through the mill levy calculation that we just went through, which would allow them to get an inflationary increase and an increase from newly taxable property from that $4 million. So it would likely increase each year after the first year. The mechanics of a voted levy are listed here for you. A dollar amount levy is going to raise a consistent amount of dollars, and the mills will adjust to raise that amount of revenue. A mill levy that's a number of mills has the mills set and the dollars will fluctuate. So if the taxable value is increasing, the number of mills levy will raise more money. If the taxable value is decreasing, a number of mill levy will raise less money. And you can see that last example was kind of an example that would fall in between these two categories as a middle way. It allows some growth for the local government without allowing a lot of growth if the taxable value increases a lot. However, for both of these, the governing body can choose not to levy the entire voted authority if they decide they don't need that much money. And if they do choose to reduce the levy for a year, they do not lose authority to increase back to the maximum that was voted by the voters. Finally, I want to mention that the Revenue Interim Committee did request legislation. They're proposing a committee bill that would revise this process. It's LC 88 and it's linked here. This bill would revise the voted levy law to only allow a levy to be stated as a dollar amount. So it would basically strike the second item here. A mill levy could not be listed as a number of mills. It also would allow for that dollar amount levy to reference 1510-420 and allow for adjustment by inflation and newly taxable property. That's all I've got for you today. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any, and I'll note that while we are recording this session, we will clip off any questions asked and they will not be posted with the recording. So feel free to ask any questions.